Tick-tock, time to rock. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's watching all around the world. I'm your friendly neighborhood philosopher, David Wood. And with me now is the famous Brother Rachid. Brother Rachid he would be on my Mount Rushmore. He would be on if I got to make a Mount Rushmore of the great apologists against Islam. Brother Rachid would be one of the four on that mount. Hey Rachid, how you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. And since this, I'm assuming a ton of most of the people here are. We have Christians. We have lots of Christians here. We also have lots of Muslims. We have lots of atheists. We have Hindus. But basically, the people here are interested a lot in the topics we deal with, and one of the main topics we'll deal with is Islam. So I'm assuming that a good number of the people here are already familiar with you, and of course, you notified people as well, so they know you.
My tribe.
Yeah, your tribe. But for those who might not know you, why don't you go ahead and give a little background as to your background, and then before we get into our topic.
Yes, my name is Rachid. I was born and raised in Morocco as a Muslim. Then I came to the Lord through TWR, through a radio program. And then I did correspondence courses for 4 years. And after that, it was a long journey until I started in 2006 broadcasting on TV and doing apologetics about Islam since 2006 until now, and still going.
Well,
that's a brief summary.
That's awesome, and it's good to have you on here because you may be familiar with this, but a lot of Muslims, they tell everyone to convert and to believe in Islam, but as soon as you start pointing out problems with Islam, they say, "Oh, but it only works in Arabic."
Yes.
You guys can't understand it because it only works in Arabic. Well, guys, go ahead and try that now. Go ahead and try that now because Brother Rachid is on. All right. Well, why don't you before you actually get into your presentation, why don't you just give people an idea of what we're talking about and what we're going to be talking about and why it's important?
It is important. We are going to talk about the biography of Muhammad. The oldest biography of Muhammad we have is according to a guy named Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad Ibn Ishaq. So that's the oldest biography we have. Mm-hmm. When we were Muslims, that's where we get all of our information about Muhammad, because the Quran doesn't talk about the biography of Muhammad, doesn't give us any clue who was Muhammad, who was his dad, who was his mom, no details about him. Mm-hmm. Just 4 times was mentioned Muhammad, that's all. Mm-hmm. So if we need to know anything about Muhammad, we go to the biography of Ibn Ishaq. So it is very important. And we actually took everything in that biography for granted. And then when I started studying it, I found out there are striking similarities between the biography of Muhammad and the Gospels, and this is what we are going to discuss tonight.
Mm-hmm. And I just want everyone to realize how big a problem history is going to turn out to be for Muslims here, because naturally, just like Brother Rachid just pointed out, when I started studying Islam, this was where I wanted to go, right? I wanted to know,
yes,
what are your earliest sources, right? That's the natural inclination. I don't want something that comes from 200, 300, 400 years afterwards. I want the earliest, and so I looked up what's the earliest biographical source on Muhammad, and it's the life of Muhammad. It's right here.
Yes.
So Ibn Ishaq. It's Ibn Ishaq. So started reading that, and then I would find some really embarrassing material in here, and I would bring it to my friend Nabil, because he was the reason I was studying any of this in the first place. And I would go to Nabil and I would say, "Oh my goodness, look at what this says! You got this story of the satanic verses right here," and I would start pointing out all this stuff. And that's when Nabil told me, well, no, you should only go to later Muslim sources like Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Only come to me with that material. So I started. That's why I bought Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and started going through those. And then I was coming to Nabil with that material. And finally, he said, well, since hadiths can be fabricated, only come to me with material from the Quran. And so I'm just even back then I noticed it, Brother Rachid, that if they tell me that their earliest source can't be trusted, and they're telling me I can't even bring stuff from the later sources because there are all these fabricated hadiths, and then you read about people like Bukhari who had to go through literally hundreds of thousands of narrations to get to those ones that he considered most reliable, and then Muslims attack those and say don't believe those. They're basically telling me that the early centuries of Islam, the early Muslim community, were the biggest bunch of liars and fabricators the world has ever seen. And then they're telling me to trust in the man who produced this community, to tell that I'm supposed to trust that community, what they say about Muhammad. And you guys are the ones telling me I can't trust any of these people. Now all of that comes from what Muslims have said, but you're going to argue that we actually can't trust our earliest source?
Yes, actually we can't trust it. We can't trust the biography of Muhammad according to Ibn Ishaq for several reasons, and I will go through them right now.
All right.
So,
all right.
First, yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to tell everyone, you're going to put a PowerPoint up, right?
Yes,
okay.
Here it is.
All right, one second so I can get you full screen. I will get myself out of this, and ladies and gentlemen, I will just let Brother Rachid go through his presentation. If anything isn't clear for some reason, then I might jump in for a comment or a question or something like that. Other than that, the show is yours, Brother Rachid.
Yes, first of all, I will call it the biggest forgery in history, because we believe a biography, we believe that it's authentic, but it turned out it's not authentic at all. So Muhammad's biography, I call it the biggest forgery in Islamic history. The first big question, why we do not have a biography of Muhammad in the first 100 years? Is there a reason, an excuse? Look at Christians, for example. They were persecuted. They had, they suffered. They were killed. They were burned alive. They had so many problems. They didn't have power. They didn't have the means. But still, they were able to write not just one biography, 4 biographies from the first 100 years of Christianity. Why nothing similar happened to Islam? Islam, they had the power, they were the rulers, they had the money, they had the writers, they had everything, but still they didn't produce a simple biography of Muhammad in the first 100 years. So that leaves us with a big question. Is there a reason to doubt? Probably there are so many problems with the figure of Muhammad. Did he exist as we were told later? Is he the same person, or something happened on the way? I think they forged his biography. So many things about him are not historical at all. And that's why they never wrote the biography the first time. So who wrote the first biography of Muhammad? His name is Muhammad, the same name as Muhammad. He lived from 699 to 769. And his name is Ibn Ishaq, means his dad was Ishaq. Ibn means the son. So Muhammad, the son of Ishaq, the son of Yasar, Ibn Yasar. Just for you to know, Yasar was a Christian. And when Muslims invaded Iraq, what is called today Iraq, Khalid ibn al-Walid, he took this young boy, Yasar, he took him as a slave to Medina. And he sold him to the family of Muhammad. So he was a slave, belongs to the family of Muhammad, Yasar. He was a Christian. He was the sources, the only sources of Islam. They tell us, Ibn Sa'd, for example, he tells us that Yasar was studying in a church. He was studying theology in the gospel. So Yasar, the grandfather of Muhammad ibn Ishaq, was Christian. He was very familiar with the gospels. So I'm sure that Ibn Ishaq knows Syriac and knows Christianity because of his family's history. And that's why he was able to write such a biography. And why he wrote it, if you go to the Gospels, yes, 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 yes. And another thing we should note here, he went to, yeah, yes.
Oh, I apologize to everyone. I just talked for a couple minutes and I had muted my mic. All right, everyone.
Oh,
Everyone, that was
I'm
my
sorry.
that was my fault. Everyone, I muted my mic and then I started talking for a couple minutes. I started talking for a couple minutes. Rachid could hear me talking, but you guys couldn't hear me talking. So he could hear me through Skype, but you guys couldn't hear. Anyway, sorry about that. Anyway, what I was saying was I was talking to Karm because Karm said in my book it said Muhammad died in 632. I was pointing out that Muhammad on the slide here is not Muhammad the prophet. This is Muhammad ibn Ishaq, right? The
Yes,
author
yes,
of the author
yes,
of the Sirat Rasul Allah.
yes,
So yeah, we're not talking about the Prophet Muhammad right now. Muhammad ibn Ishaq wrote the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and Rashid here has on the slide. He just breaks it down into Muhammad. So his first name is Muhammad. He's called Ibn Ishaq, which just means son of Ishaq. So that's his that Ishaq is his father, and then his grandfather was a Christian slave, and so Brother Rashid is pointing out that that Ibn Ishaq, who wrote this biography, would have been familiar with Christianity because he comes from a Christian family. So I'm assuming I do not know Rashid's presentation. I haven't seen it before, but I'm assuming that that is going to be very important for what's coming up.
yes. It's very important because he knows the Gospels, he knows Syriac, he's very familiar with Christian literature, and he knows the biography of Jesus Christ, which is in the Gospels. Ibn Ishaq went to what is called now today Baghdad, went from Medina to Iraq. I'm sorry, he went to what we call today Iraq, and he wrote the biography of Muhammad in Iraq, in the town of his grandfather Yasar. So he went there. And why he wrote the biography of Muhammad? If you read the Gospels, you don't find anybody paying the writers to write a biography. They were not paid to do it. They did it because they loved Jesus Christ. They loved their master. And they wanted to write down everything he said, everything he did, and tell everybody else about it. But for Muslims, the reason why Ibn Ishaq wrote this, because the Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur ordered him to do it. He gave him an order and he paid him as well. So he was paid, ordered by the Caliph to do it. And that's a huge difference with the Gospels because they were written for different reasons. And that brings us to the Caliph al-Mansur. He ruled from 754 to 775. So we are assuming sometime between 754 and 769 this biography was written. The time when Muhammad ibn Ishaq died and the time when the Caliph ruled. So there are some 15 years there. So to give it an estimate, Muhammad died 632, the Prophet Muhammad, and the first biography probably written around 760. And that's a huge gap. We have almost 130 years gap. There's so many things that can happen during 130 years. And as I said at the beginning, why they never wrote a biography in the first 100 years. There's another problem. Do we have a copy of the biography of Ibn Ishaq? No, we don't. So what we have today, actually, it's not the biography of Ibn Ishaq. It's the biography of Ibn Hisham. That's another problem we add to Ibn Ishaq. So we have 130 years, but still we have zero biography. Who is Ibn Hisham? Ibn Hisham is a student to Ziyad al-Bakai. Ziyad al-Bakai is a student to Ibn Ishaq. See the gap now? It's from 769 to 802 to 833. So actually we have a biography that was written 833. That's 200 years from the death of Muhammad. Ibn Hisham, he heavily edited the biography he took from this guy Ziyad, which he edited from Ibn Ishaq. So we have a forged biography edited by a student and handed to another student who edited that edited biography. So the gap is big and the problems are getting bigger. So now it's 200 years from 632 to 833. What's the reputation of Ibn Ishaq, the original writer or the guy who we were told he wrote the biography? He was known as a forger among Muslim scholars. Do you know him? Do you know he forges stuff? He makes up stuff. Malik ibn Anas, which is he's the founder of the Maliki school, said about Ibn Ishaq, Dajjal min ad-Dajajila, means he is one of the biggest liars. He is a quack of many quacks. That's what he said. This is a scholar. That's not me or David. That's Malik ibn Anas. Malik ibn Anas, he's one of the biggest early scholars in Islam. He said, never trust Ibn Ishaq because he's one of the biggest liars. So Muslims are telling me today they got their biography from the biggest liar ever. Not trusted by al-Bukhari or by Ahmad. They didn't trust him. So that's why we don't find his hadiths in Sahih al-Bukhari or in Musnad Ahmad, because they don't trust him. They don't rely on him. But still, we have his biography until today. And I want to add this. David, you debated so many Muslims, and I'm sure they bring that the Paraclete or Paracletus is Muhammad, right?
Oh yeah, that's one of their favorite passage to go to in the New Testament. They have Deuteronomy 18:18 is their favorite from the Old Testament, and this is the favorite from the New Testament.
The first guy who forged this argument is Ibn Ishaq. He is the one who came up with this idea because he tried to forge everything in the Gospels and make it look like it is about Muhammad. not about Jesus. So he is the first one who made this argument. And since then, nothing changed. The dad repeated the same thing. Zakir Naik repeats the same thing even until today. They're not creative. They just repeat what Ibn Ishaq said for 1,300 years. So next time when they bring it, tell them who was the first one to use this. One of the biggest liars in Islamic history, as Malik said about him. So now we go back to the Gospels and Muhammad's biography according to Ibn Hisham, who took it from Ziyad, who took it from Ibn Ishaq, which was 200 years later, from the time when Muhammad died. The first thing that Ibn Ishaq started the biography with is the genealogy. Does that ring a bell for you, David? He started by Ibn, son of that, son of that, son of that, son of that, to go up.
Yeah, sounds like a gospel.
Exactly. So why would Ibn Ishaq start with the genealogy? Because he was copying from the Gospels. He was looking at a model. So if you were in the 7th century or the 8th century and you want to write a biography, what is the best source to go to? What is the most available biography around you if you are in a Christian environment in what is called today Iraq? It was Christian, almost 100% Christian. Mm-hmm. So he looks at the Gospels and he knows Syriac. So he started imitating everything in the Gospels. So he started with the genealogy to prove that Muhammad is the son of Ishmael, to bring him to Abraham, to find a legitimacy. So the first thing he forged is the genealogy of Muhammad. And let's look at some striking similarities. The biography of Muhammad starts with the genealogy. The Gospels, especially Luke and Matthew, they start with the genealogy. And there is a star of Muhammad. I'm going to show you the page later. There is a star. It's called the Star of Muhammad. And I think everybody knows the Star of Bethlehem, the Star of Jesus. So that it doesn't take a brain to know that. The prophecies about Muhammad, the first thing that Ibn Ishaq started talking about are Christians and Jews talking about the coming one, the prophet. And that looks like the Gospels exactly, because Matthew brings the prophecies first before he starts talking about the mission of Jesus Christ. So we have 3 elements: genealogy, the star, and the prophecies before the mission of Muhammad. And that's a clear, if I don't want to say he stole it, at least it's a borrowing. The genealogy, it's in page 3. If you have the same version as David, when you showed at the beginning, it's in page 3, and you will find Muhammad's star in page 70. It says, "Tonight has risen a star under which Ahmad is to be born." That means a Jew who said that. I heard a Jew calling out at the top of his voice from the top of a fort in Yathrib, and he told his fellow Jews that there is tonight a star was risen, or has risen. The prophecies, we can find them in different pages, but especially page 79, the story of Bahira. When he went to Damascus, Muhammad went with his uncle to Damascus for a caravan, with a caravan. And also Bahira saw his description in the Christian books. That's what the biography says, that this Christian monk found the signs of Muhammad in Christian books. So always Ibn Ishaq is trying to find something in Christian books to say it is about Muhammad. Means he was looking into the Gospels. When did Muhammad go to Syria? Do you have an idea, David? Did you hear it from Muslims?
No, actually, I have no idea.
They say, if you ask any Muslim, when did Muhammad go to Syria? They will say age of 12. That's not from the biography of Muhammad, but it's in other books. But does that ring a bell at age of 12?
Yeah, with Jesus traveling at age 12. Yeah.
Exactly. So everything they are trying to make it look like Jesus, everything about Muhammad. So at age of 12, he went to Syria and he had this discussion with the monk, with a Christian monk. The same thing, Jesus, he had a discussion with the Jewish scholars when he went with his mom and dad. And other similarities, at age of 40, page 104, he started his mission or ministry, Muhammad. Jesus at age of 30. So Ibn Ishaq was playing with numbers here. And Muhammad went to the cave of Hira, page 106. Jesus went to the wilderness. Muhammad was fasting. Sorry, I forgot an S here. Fasting for 30 days, page 106. Jesus was fasting for 40 days. So he adds a 10 here, he removes a 10 there just to make it look a little bit different, but it is the same. And Muhammad met a spiritual being. They say it's Gabriel, the angel, at page 106. Jesus met a spiritual being, but it was the devil. And this spiritual being with Muhammad, he quoted what is called scripture, the Quran. And with Jesus, he quoted scripture, the Bible. So you can see there is a pattern here. Don't you see it, David?
Yeah, there are some definite similarities here.
Yes. And at the start of his ministry, Muhammad, after the encounter with the angel, he came back and he started choosing disciples like Ali and like others, Khadija, and he started talking to others. He made many followers after that. The same thing Jesus did after the wilderness. And Muhammad started his secret ministry, page 115. The same thing. Jesus he didn't have a public ministry at the beginning. And then Muhammad proclaimed his ministry. The same thing Jesus did later in his town. And then persecution started. The same thing with Jesus, persecution started. And then Hijrah from Mecca. Then Jesus left Nazareth. And they attempted an assassination before he left. Muhammad, if you remember, they put Ali instead of him, and then he left with Abu Bakr, and then they tried to follow them, and then they made it to Medina, if you're familiar with that story. And the same thing with Jesus. They attempted an assassination on the mountain. They tried to push him from the mountain, and he just went through them. It sounds like a miracle. And the same thing with Muhammad. It sounds like a miracle. He escaped. He went actually, and they were looking and they didn't see him. That's what the biography of Muhammad said. And then he started his expeditions or raids, and Jesus started his ministry. There are some striking similarities here, and I think Muhammad ibn Ishaq was borrowing from the Gospels and was forging a biography. We don't know for sure if these things happened. Actually, I have many doubts after seeing this. He made up so many things. According to Muslim scholars, he is a liar, so I wouldn't be surprised if he makes most of this biography from just borrowing from the Gospels. And actually, he had a 12. If we go back to the disciples, actually the first in Bay'at al-Aqaba, they call it al-Aqaba, it's when the helpers, 12 of them, they came and they made a covenant with Muhammad, and that's in page 198. There were 12 of them. The first 12 helpers from Medina, there were 12 of them. And I wonder where he took that number 12 from. It's obviously from the disciples. There were 12 of them. And you can see it here, page 204 too, the names of the 12 leaders in the rest of the story of Al-Aqaba, the 12 leaders. So Muhammad made 12 helpers, Ansar, like Jesus with the 12 Ansar or the 12 disciples. If you go to miracles, Muhammad healed Qatada's eye, page 381. And we know about Jesus, he did heal the blind. Muhammad increased food, page 452. And Jesus multiplied the fish and the bread. And actually, there is a funny story here. Muhammad, he multiplied dates because they couldn't talk about fish. It will be like obvious it's a forgery. So he changed it to dates instead of fish and bread. And I like Ibn Ishaq when he tries to find something that he changes to look like real, but you can catch him easily, because if you follow the pattern of the biography, you will see clearly it's following the Gospels. In the last days, Muhammad was killed by a Jewish lady. She poisoned him, and Jesus was killed by Jewish leaders and the Romans, but especially by Jewish leaders because they were the one behind it. So there are some similarities here. So if you look at all these details, I think we are in front of one of the most forged biographies in history. And just to give a summary right now, if you have a biography written 200 years later, heavily edited, and then the writer is a famous liar, and not only he wrote it, he copied other books, are you going to trust that? Are you going to say we're here about a historical figure? So many things about Muhammad are not historical at all, especially the miracles. If we know that the Quran denied miracles for Muhammad, I'm going to read from chapter 17, verse 59. Nothing has prevented us from sending signs except that former people denied them. So the Quran says there are no miracles for Muhammad because previous people, they didn't believe when we sent miracles to them. That's what the Quran says. And you find Ibn Ishaq filling his biography with hundreds of miracles to Muhammad, just because he saw the Gospels are full of miracles. And then he realized it will look really weak if Muhammad didn't have miracles. If we go back to the name Muhammad itself, I have doubts about the name itself. Muhammad is not a name, actually. It's a description. It's the glorified one. So he was trying to glorify Muhammad as Jesus. If we go back to Muslim sources, you will find his name was Quthum when he was born. Quthum, not Muhammad. So when you name him the glorified one, the praised one, Muhammad is the praised one. The praised one is Jesus, not Muhammad. So everything about Muhammad was made to look like Jesus. He's the last one. He's the Omega. He's the Omega, and we know Jesus is the Omega, not Muhammad. So he's the last prophet, and he made Jesus look like the Baptist to him. He announced the coming of Ahmad. He announced the coming of the one. Actually, in Islam, we name people Mustafa. Mustafa means the chosen one. And we believe that Muhammad his name was Mustafa, actually, was the chosen one. And the chosen one is the Messiah, is the Christ, the chosen one, the anointed one. He was chosen to save his people, not Muhammad. So when you say he's the chosen one, he's the last one, and Jesus was like the Baptist to him, then you are just forging a biography and making everything about Muhammad look like Jesus. You don't have an authentic person. You don't have a person to present here. You have an imitation. It's like the Chinese products. When the U.S. makes something, the Chinese just try to look at it and make something that looks like it, but it's cheap. It breaks easily. So Ibn Ishaq, he tried to make a figure that looks like Jesus, but it is cheap. It's made in China. It breaks when you look at it very closely. So Muhammad, there are so many things about him are fake if you look at it. We don't know actually how much was fake and how much was real. Is it 90%? Is it 80%? Is it 70%? We don't know. We just know that Ibn Ishaq was forging a biography. He was the biggest liar you can have in Islam. Even Muslim scholars didn't trust him, and still we take the biography of Muhammad from him. So I'll leave it to you, Dave, so you can start asking some questions. We can go deeper a little bit here.
Yeah. This is a tricky one. So I just want to break down basically two views of Ibn Ishaq. And so one will be the sort of traditional view, and then this with the modified view, because my position is going to be, which we have no way of telling what's going on in the early history of Islam, because everyone's accusing everyone of lying. Everyone's inventing stories. Even Muslims today are telling us all these guys are lying, and they tell us to go to much later people instead of the earliest people, because the earliest people are liars. Well, if the earliest historians are liars, how are the later people learning more and more as they go on about Muhammad if they're not fabricating things? But here's what you have. Here's what you have, ladies and gentlemen. So let me give you the traditional view of basically those of us who deal with Islam, the traditional view of Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq writes a biography, and makes perfect sense that later Hadith scholars are going to attack him and call him a liar, because there were these two competing schools of thought on history. You had your Hadith guys and you had your Sirah guys, and they eventually were in conflict, and the Hadith scholars were trying to consolidate power around themselves and say that their method was the only correct method, and so they basically would start throwing all the Sirah guys under the bus. So that was one issue. The other issue was certain doctrines that were not around at the time of Ibn Ishaq were around at the time of later Hadith guys, and so some of this material was very embarrassing. Like Brother Rachid talked about Ibn Hisham giving us an edited version of Ibn Ishaq. One of the things he took out, for instance, was the story of the satanic verses. Ibn Hisham, I mean, he even says it. He even says we have to take out some of the stuff that Ibn Ishaq is talking about because it's embarrassing. So he took out the story of the satanic verses, even though we know it was actually in there. So one of the things that happens is by the time you get to people like Bukhari and Muslim and so on, they regard lots of stories as false because they're so embarrassing, and they've all started deleting the embarrassing history about Muhammad. And so what do you do if you've got a guy a century earlier and he's reporting it? Well, you just we'll start calling him a liar. So that would be one view of Ibn Ishaq. The people are accusing him, are insulting him, accusing him of lying because he has all this embarrassing material, and they're trying to set up a rival methodology and say that their method of history is the only way of doing things. Therefore, other people are all just liars. So that's one view. But notice, whatever view you take, you've got some problems here. So think about this view. All right, think about this view, because you can be looking at those parallels and you might be thinking, oh, I'm not sure about that. Maybe there just were these similarities. But think about this. On the issue of miracles, we know, according to the Quran, as Brother Rachid mentioned, that Muhammad performed no miracles. He was challenged over and over and over again like a beating drum throughout the Quran by unbelievers. This is in the Quran. Perform a miracle. Come on, why can't you perform a miracle like the earlier prophets? Why do you not have any miracles? And Muhammad over and over again, I'm just a warner, I'm just a warner, I'm just a warner, I'm just a warner. My only miracle is the Quran. Suddenly you go to these later Muslim sources. And they're filled with all of these miracle claims. Now, it's obvious that Muslims along the way, they invent these miracle stories, but think about that, right? So, if Muslims are inventing the miracle stories, why are they inventing the miracle stories? They're inventing the miracle stories to make Muhammad seem more like people like Jesus who performed miracles. So it's clear. So it's one, no matter what your view is, it's indisputable that the early Muslim community is inventing things about Muhammad to make him sound like sound like earlier people who could do things that Muhammad couldn't. So the question is, as Rachid pointed out, to what extent are they doing this, right? I mean, Muslims will tell us that they're inventing, that people were lying about things like the satanic verses. That makes no sense. Why would they make something up that's embarrassing to them? So that doesn't make any sense. It makes sense that Muslims would invent a lot of stories to make Muhammad look better. But now the question becomes, how much were they inventing? We know they're inventing some things. We know they're inventing miracle stories.
Yeah.
So how much is it? And Rachid, I just want to point out, see, like I don't believe that. I don't believe there's any way Muslims were inventing things like, like Muhammad and the satanic verses. I take that as very, very strong, historically based on the principle of embarrassment, that people tend not to invent things that are embarrassing, and we know that was embarrassing because they keep changing the story as time goes on. But notice what you have here. You've got the material that we know was invented by later Muslims to make Muhammad sound more like Jesus, like the miracles. But then Muslims are telling us that all these other stories, even embarrassing stories, those are fabrications. And so once again, what we get back to is the early Muslim historians were the biggest bunch of liars the world has ever seen. It is kind of a position of, we don't know. We don't know. Is it 90%? Is it 80%? Is it 70%? Is it 60%? It's when basically Muslims, when you guys are the ones telling us that these guys are lying about everything that you don't like, and then the stuff that you do like Muhammad's miracle stories, we know we know that didn't happen. We know that they're making that up. You're throwing your entire first couple of centuries of Muslim historians under the bus and telling us not to trust them, but then telling us to trust what these guys report about Muhammad that you like, and you can't.
There is another problem here, David. Mm-hmm. If we are accusing these guys of being a bunch of liars and they cannot be trusted, mm-hmm. how are we going to trust them with the Quran? Because the Quran didn't come from another line. It came from the same people. So if you are telling me they forged hadiths, what's going to stop them from forging verses? If they played with the sacred, they can't play with any sacred text. And especially they had some reasons to do it. The Abbasids with the Umayyads and the fighting overpowered. So they had so many reasons. And actually there is something I forgot to say here. Ibn Hisham, he removed something because it's going to be offensive to the Abbasids. Mm-hmm. He removed the fact that Abbas, their grandfather, he was one of the Quraysh people against Muhammad in Badr. So Ibn Hisham, he removed that thing because it will offend the ruling party, the ruling family.
So hang on. So it's not just hey, this material makes our prophet look bad, like with the satanic verses, right? We can't have our prophet delivering revelations from the devil. You're also saying it's purely political motivations as well. My leaders right now won't like this, so I need to change the story so I don't hurt the feelings of my leaders.
Yes, exactly. So when you have something like that, how are you going to trust them? What if we had some verses that are going to offend the Umayyads or the Abbasids? Probably they removed them. Probably they changed them. So we have nothing to trust here. We have no solid ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's Muslims. It looks bad. You again. This comes from you guys, right? You guys are the ones saying, "Oh, don't trust this guy." And pretty much anyone we go to, we find all kinds of people. We find all kinds of people telling us not to trust those guys. I mean, this is on a big scale, because any Sunni source we quote, Shias will tell us, no, those guys are all liars. Right? Any Shia source we quote, Sunnis will tell us, no, those guys are all liars. And then within those communities, they'll be attacking each other. No, this guy had the wrong methodology. He's a liar. No, he said something embarrassing. He's a liar. And they're all calling each other liars. And so no matter where we go to learn about your prophet, we have an endless array of devout Muslims saying, you cannot trust this man. He is a horrible, horrible liar and a deceiver, which means that we just have nowhere to go. Where can we go in Islam to learn about Muhammad where we are not going to be told by tons of Muslims, you can't trust him, he's a horrible liar? Where are we going?
No, And people of Quran only, they have a bigger problem, because if you rely on the Quran only, there are some verses you have no way to know the meaning except through the biography and the hadith. I can interpret them in any way or shape or form if you remove the background, if you remove the hadith and the seerah. There are some words in Arabic that you will not understand at all, even for a person like me, who's the Arabic language is my first language, and still I cannot understand them, because you need a commentary or a biography or the hadith to explain what happened there. And another problem, more than 80% of Islam comes from the hadith, not from the Quran. So if you rely on the Quran, there are no 5 prayers. How are you going to pray? Who told you there are 5? And how are you going to perform those prayers? There is no description of a prayer in the Quran in details. And if you want to rely only on the Quran, who was Muhammad? Who was his father? Who was his mom? What happened? How do we know he got a revelation? Do you have the story there? You have no story there. And actually, let me open a window here. The story of the revelation, if you read Ibn Ishaq, it was just a dream. If you read Al-Bukhari, it was a reality, it's not a dream. So the story changed. The early biography, he saw a dream. If you go later, they removed the part of the dream and it became a real thing. He saw an angel, it was not a dream. And that's another thing that I need to emphasize here, that even the story of read in the name of your Lord, I think Ibn Ishaq borrowed it from St. Augustine. Because if you read St. Augustine in the Confessions, he heard a voice telling him to read 2 times. And he took it as from the Lord. He was telling him to go read the Bible, and that's actually was the turning point in his life. So if Ibn Ishaq is familiar with Christian literature, I'm sure he heard about St. Augustine, and I'm sure he read some of his stuff. So probably he borrowed that story and he made it about Muhammad. The Quran doesn't tell us how Muhammad got the revelation.
So along that point, along those points right there, that Ibn Ishaq came from a Christian family that would have been familiar with Christian sources, Christian stories,
Yes.
and we know that the early Muslims were inventing miracle stories. They're just fabricating these things, and so guys, Muslims, what do you do here? I would like to hear from some Muslims. We know you're there. We see you. We see you guys. Go ahead and tell us how can we learn about your prophet? Please tell us. Don't say go to the Quran. As Rachid pointed out, the Quran only even mentions his name 4 times. You can't understand this stuff. You can't understand these verses without going outside the Quran. Now that's a massive contradiction, because the Quran claims over and over again to be clear, but it's just not, right? It's just not. That's why you have the tafsir. That's why you have these commentaries trying to explain the background. But if that background, if the tafsir trying to explain what the verses mean in light of the historical background, and we can't trust the people who gave the historical background because they're fabricating stories left and right, how do we learn? Put all this together. How do we can't understand the Quran because we can't know to what extent we can trust the biographers, and therefore we can't know if we can trust the commentaries because they're going to the hadith collectors and the historians. But these guys are making stuff up left and right, and admittedly, even according to Muslims. So if we can't understand what the Quran, you got 2 problems with the Quran. One, if we can't understand what the Quran means without the historical background, and we can't actually know the historical background because your guys are a bunch of liars, that's a problem. 2, how do we, if we don't know the real historical background of Muhammad, how do we know whether we should trust him, trust his revelations, trust him as a true prophet, and take the Quran seriously if we can't know anything about him because the people who are recording his history are making things up left and right? you've got a big mess on your hands, and you're telling us, no, ignore all of that, just ignore all of that, and just believe in him anyway. And all I can say is no. Yep.
Yeah, how do we know that Muhammad had a wife named Aisha?
Yeah.
You don't read it in the Quran. How do you know who's Zayd, who is mentioned in the Quran, and what happened to him, and why that verse is there, and how do we know that his wife was Zainab? We have no way to say. So I'm just giving examples that the story or the verses are really ambiguous. You cannot tell the meaning unless you read the biography.
And I had a question here from Alejandros, who said, what do the satanic verses say? The satanic verses, Alejandro, I have actually got it right around here somewhere. We have about 50 sources that have been translated into English on the satanic verses. Shahab Ahmed, before he died, the book came out afterwards, but he had assembled 50 sources on the satanic verses. But the earlier versions of the story basically say that Muhammad was longing for a revelation that would help his people come to Islam. So he's upset that his people weren't coming to Islam. So he's longing for a revelation, and then he starts receiving Quran verses. But then Satan sneaks in there and he receives these verses saying that Muslims can pray to 3 pagan goddesses, Alat, Aluz, and Manat, and that they're basically like these, you can think of them as like bird goddesses who can carry your prayers up to Allah. So they're intercessors. You talk to them, and then they will carry your prayers to Allah. So it's okay to pray to them because, Allah is still the main God. So Muhammad received these revelations. He delivered them to his followers. He bowed down in honor of them. His followers bowed down, but then the pagans saw this. The pagans saw this, and they bowed down too. They bowed down because Muhammad had honored their pagan goddesses and shown support for them. Anyway, Muhammad comes back a little later. This is according to the story. Muhammad comes back a little later and says, sorry, the devil made me do it. Satan tricked me into delivering these verses. And there are so many issues with that when you put all this together. I mean, one, Muhammad admittedly delivered a revelation from the devil, which according to Deuteronomy 18:20, he would have been stoned to death by Moses. Moses would have stoned him to death for delivering a revelation that actually came from Satan. Two, it means Muhammad couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from Satan. Why in the world am I trusting your revelations when admittedly you can't tell the difference? So you got all these problems. Third, it just shatters the idea that no one can make something like the Quran. Satan gave verses. The Muslim community couldn't tell the difference. They didn't say, "Oh, that's different from the Quran. The Quran is so eloquent, but Satan's verses are much worse." So it destroys the idea that no one can come up with something like verses of the Quran. So you just end up with so many problems here. And in addition to all of this, you have the historical problems where Muslims start trying to weed this story and many other stories out of their sources because it's so embarrassing and humiliating, which is why it's just hard to trust these guys. And so this is one big, massive mess here. I mean, we can quote your sources, and we will quote your sources. We'll keep quoting your sources to show you that you got some really weird stuff in your sources, but it is hard to take all this stuff seriously.
Yes.
All right. So, I guess we anything else you want to go into before we start taking some questions here?
Well, I just want somebody to start thinking. I used to believe this stuff. I used to take this biography seriously. I used to trust it with all my heart. And when you start studying and using your logic, I mean, come on. I cannot trust Ibn Ishaq. And how I'm going to trust these guys with my life, with my eternity? There is a huge problem if you cannot trust them with little stories and they can change them and play with them. Do you think I can trust them with my life? There is a huge question that a Muslim should ask. It's not a fight, a game between Islam and Christianity. It's a gambling with your own life. Am I going to trust Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham? They are saying the truth? No. But I'm going to trust the guys who gave their lives for what they believed. all the followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, they were killed for their faith. Some of them, they were crucified, like Peter, as the church history says. So all of them except John, they gave a price for their faith. So I can trust them because they died for what they believe. These guys didn't die. Ibn Ishaq didn't die for these things. He just made stories so the Caliph can pay him. And the more he writes, the more he gets paid. He didn't have if he had a faith behind it, why Muslims waited for all these years to write the biography of Muhammad? That's the question you should ask. And plus, when you see somebody reading the Gospels and trying to borrow stories from them, it means they have nothing to offer. They have nothing to give. They just were looking around them and trying to copy other stories. It's like a student in an exam. He has nothing to give, nothing to produce. He's just looking around to other students who did their work, their homework, and he's trying to get stuff from them. Jesus had something to give. The disciples had something to give. But Ibn Ishaq he knew that Muhammad had nothing to give. He was borrowing and he was patching stories from here and there to make a figure like Muhammad and present it to the whole world. So these are my comments and why I want to bring the story of the biography, because for me it was a big shock. Mm-hmm. For me it was a big shock to read, and that's why, by the way, if you read the Quran, you find that the Quran asks you to ask the people of the book. Mm-hmm. But when you go to hadiths and other stuff, they don't allow you to ask the people of the book. And that's a dilemma, because they know we will find out. I always ask myself why they are not allowing us as a Muslims to read Christian books. Why they are telling us they are forged. Because if we read them, we will find out. We will find out that these guys are lying. They are borrowing stuff. They are doing plagiarism. They are taking stuff from the Gospels and they are claiming Muhammad did that. No, he didn't multiply the food. Jesus did. He didn't heal the blind. Jesus did. If he healed the blind, the Quran will talk about it and will brag about it. But he never did. Mm-hmm. So there is a dilemma here, and I think from all my heart, I'm just addressing every Muslim just to think, forget about David and Rashid. Mm-hmm. Just think about yourself. Are you going to trust Ibn Ishaq?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here, notice, Rashid, Muslims do the same thing today that they were doing back then, right?
Yeah.
One, they'll make stuff up left and right. They will make up all kinds of things about Muhammad. So that's one thing. But as far as the removing embarrassing material, think about this. The earliest source contains all of this embarrassing material, and Muslims start removing the material, and they sanitize it based on their theology and based on their goal of glorifying Muhammad, and they keep removing material. Well, here we are, 14 centuries after Muhammad, and we have the sources like Bukhari and Muslim that have already supposedly been sanitized. In other words, the Muslim community over 2 centuries had removed the most embarrassing stuff, and they got to the material that they thought was most reliable. They got to the material they thought was best. Again, Bukhari went through, according to him, hundreds of thousands of stories to get to the best stuff about Muhammad. And then we give this material to Muslims today and say, look at all the horrible things your prophet did. And they start, no, he didn't do that. No, he didn't do that. No, he didn't do that. Yeah. These guys, someone must have made those things up too. So it's just, here's the problem. There's nowhere we can go to learn about Muhammad, apparently. But Muslims have this idea of Muhammad in their head as this great, wonderful man. Muslims, where are you getting that idea from? Where are you getting, you know where you're getting it from? You got it from your imam. You got it from your parents. You got it from the Muslim community. You did not get that from anything remotely resembling a historical examination of Muhammad. And if you wanted to do a historical examination of Muhammad, you have to go to those sources. And if you go to those sources, your conclusions are Muhammad was one of the weirdest, creepiest, most perverted people ever, or those sources are all lying, in which case I have nowhere to go, and all I can do is just go with what my imam told me that goes against all evidence ever. This is what an amazing religion. This is the religion that we're all supposed to convert to. This is a religion that you condemn Rachid for leaving.
Well, I mean, the first thing you look at you look into, if somebody's asking me to convert to any religion, the first thing I look into is the character of the leader, the founder of this religion. And if you are telling me to convert to Islam, I need to know who is Muhammad, because I'm going to trust him with my life. And if I want to read about Muhammad, where should I go to? To Ibn Ishaq. If I find out that Ibn Ishaq is lying and forging, and Ibn Hisham did the same thing to this biography, so you are telling me to trust a Muhammad that I don't know? I have no clue about him except some stories that could be faked. I don't know, 90%, 80%, 70%. I have no trust in these sources. So don't ask me to follow a leader that I know nothing about, and the things that I know about, I'm not sure of them.
Yeah, and here's what's amazing is this complete reversal of how history works when you're dealing with Islam and Muslims, because Muslims, actual historians, if they read your sources, and they say, what are the things in your sources that we can trust most as historians? What are the things what are the things that we should trust most? Historians would say the things that you should trust most are the most embarrassing things, right? Because those are the least likely to be invented. And, things like miracle stories, they're not going to trust those as much unless you can make a really good case, which you can never make any case of any kind because the Quran says Muhammad never performed miracles, right? So you can never make any case for something like that. So a historian is going to look at the embarrassing stories like Muhammad taking the wife of his own adopted son, the Muhammad in the Satanic verses, Muhammad getting caught with his slave girl, Mary the Copt, and then promising his wives that he would stop having sex with her, then getting a revelation saying, no, you need to go back to having sex with her. Go ahead and break your oaths. These kinds of things. Historians look at those kinds of things and they say, this is actually pretty decent material here, because unless someone had a really good reason for making this up, this is not the sort of stuff people make up. So that's the strongest material. But that's the material that you guys say everyone is making up.
And then you say the other way around.
Yeah, and then you say the things we need to trust about Muhammad are the things that we know were fabricated. Like, oh, you need to trust in his miracles because he did all these miracles. You tell us to trust the stuff that is obviously fabricated and to reject the stuff that is the strongest stuff historically. It's like Islam just reverses everything. It reverses the rationality of everything. How can this be from God? I don't know.
I have some questions too, David, and just think with me. I'm thinking loudly here. If you read the biography of Muhammad, you find out that his dad is named Abdullah, which means the slave of Allah. Don't you think this is made up? Because his uncles are the slave of pagan gods. Abdul Uzza, the slave of Al-Uzza. That's the guy who had a surah about him, Abu Lahab. And then his uncle, the guy who took him to Syria, his real name is Abdu Manaf. He's the slave of another pagan god, Manaf. So if you have all the uncles are slave of pagan gods, how come your dad is the slave of Allah? There's a question. I think they modified the name because it was so embarrassing and they changed it. And if we go to his mom, her name is Amina. Amina means like believer. So how come so you're trying to make his mom a believer and his dad is the slave of Allah? And those names you don't. There are so many questions about these names. I think everything about Muhammad was they tried to forge it and make it look good. And as you said, until today they are trying to edit. Until today, they are trying to modify. And I think they will keep editing and modifying until we have no record of anything historical about Muhammad.
We have a, let's see, quick question here from Tyler. Tyler says, former Muslim here, can you ask how Waraka ibn Nawfal fits into this picture? When he died, revelation stopped. Did Muhammad get more stories from him also? So what are your thoughts on Waraka? Do you think that was actually historical? Do you think Muhammad, if it was historical, do you think Muhammad, that's where Muhammad got, it sounds like he's asking, is that where Muhammad got some of the stories from the Quran from, if he knew a Christian?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to deal with everything with some doubts here, because I cannot trust the biography 100%. But as David said, there are some principles when you come to biographies like this. The embarrassing stuff should be trusted first, and then we investigate the rest. Let's try to do it here. Why would a Muslim invent that his prophet was taking stories, or at least listening to a Christian priest, and then when he died, he tried to kill himself, commit suicide? There is no reason for a believer to invent something like this about his prophet. So most likely these stories were original, and they were edited and modified later to look a little bit milder. Probably they had more details into them, but the stories got shorter and shorter because we had editors through history who changed them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the names, like why Muhammad's dad is named Abdullah. If he comes from a pagan culture, notice once again, you can have a sort of more traditional view. You could say, well, Allah is just one God among many there, and then Muhammad eventually picked him and said, this is the one God. So that's one possible explanation. The other explanation is that's just added later by someone who, I mean, think if they're writing fake stories about Muhammad left and right, which we know they were, right? The question is we do not know the exact extent to which they were fabricating. There's no denying that Muslims were fabricating stories about Muhammad. They were cooking up stories about Muhammad like they were cooking up falafel, right? I mean, they're just cooking them up, baking them out. Yeah. So the idea here is, well, we could explain it this way, we could explain it that way. We just don't know. We don't know. Maybe his dad's name was Abdullah, and someone recorded that. Maybe it's made up to make his dad the slave of Allah. We just don't know, because according to what Muslims are telling us, these were the biggest bunch of liars the world had ever seen. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have reason to doubt it, because Ibn Ishaq is writing that Amina had some light enter it. So there was some light in Abdullah when he was going to her, and then when he slept with her, some light came out of him and went to to Amina. And we know that Jesus is called in the Gospels the light. So I'm sure Ibn Ishaq wanted to somehow use that metaphor and that illustration and made it about Muhammad. So I have reasons to doubt these stories, because I see the details are not really. We are not going to believe that Abdullah was going in the streets and somebody's looking at him and saying, "Hey, you have light there. What is that kind of light?" And he just slept with a woman, and then he came out, and where that light went. So we have no reason to believe such a thing. So it's a made-up story. So the name will be the easiest thing to make in this case.
We have a comment here from Abdul Rahman Muhammad. He said, Ibn Ishaq was mentioned as a liar. Okay, I get that. Not quite, Abdul Rahman. You had Ibn Ishaq, definitely. Basically, all these guys were lying, and even if you think that some of them had good intentions, their methodology was to call everyone who shared anything embarrassing about Muhammad liars, and even the ones that you tend to trust, like Sunni Muslims generally trust, like Bukhari and Imam Muslim and so on. These guys acknowledge. I mean, Bukhari acknowledges that he has to go through hundreds of thousands of narrations to get to the ones that he regarded as strongest. So there's no question that tons and tons of earlier Muslims who came before him, are fabricating stories. And they come up with a methodology. Well, you tell me who you got it from, and then who he got it from, and 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 I'll see if this is all reliable. But notice, how do you know? How do you know how reliable that third or fourth or fifth guy on the chain is? You have to take other reports about his reliability and what kind of person he was. This is just a big mess. And the bottom line is, once you acknowledge that your early generations of historians were this big bunch of liars, there's no getting out of it. And someone brought up earlier that how do you keep how are later people more trustworthy than earlier people? That's the problem you have in Islam. You go back to the first century, they don't know anything about Muhammad. You go to the next century, well, they know enough to fill a biography. What? You go to the century after that, they have even more. The longer they go, the more people know about Muhammad, and that's backwards. Go ahead.
There are the rules they made to choose the authentic hadith and differentiate between them and the false hadith or the weak hadith. I have a problem with that methodology. First of all, they don't apply it to the first layer of companions. They apply it to the ones that came after. Because if they apply it to the first layer of companions, the first class of companions, we will not take anything from them. Because they were a bunch of they were disputing over authority, over power. So are we going to trust Aisha or Ali? Mm-hmm. And both of them tried to kill each other. Mm-hmm. So how can you trust a killer? So they made a rule, and they made the exception to the rule. They said it will not apply to the first companions. So they stopped it right there. That's the first problem I have with it. The second problem, when it comes to Ibn Ishaq, for example, they should not take anything from Ibn Ishaq if we apply their rule. But when they listen to Malik, for example, and they say, well, we will not take the what do you call it? The talk of the peers. If peers slander each other because they lived in the same period of time and they were jealous of each other, we will not take their opinions seriously about each other. Because Ibn Ishaq said Malik, he made fun of Malik, and Malik, he said this guy is the biggest liar. So they said we will not take their opinions seriously. So here is again another exception to the rule. So the rule is just like, it's flexible. Wherever you go, they can make it fit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so just to remind everyone, when you have that problem, when you have the problem where your historians are admittedly fabricating things, the only reliable material you can get out of that is the embarrassing material, the material that neither side had any reason to invent, right?
Yes.
So it's the embarrassing details about Muhammad, the satanic verses, Muhammad thinking that he was demon possessed, Muhammad trying to commit suicide repeatedly, Muhammad thinking that he was the victim of black magic that gave him delusional thoughts and false beliefs. These are the kinds of stories that historians would look at and say, okay, even though all these Muslims are calling each other liars and stuff like that, none of them had reasons to invent some of this material, and therefore we can trust that material. But that's the material you guys tell us we can't trust. We can't trust, which means we can't trust anything, and yet you're telling us to believe in your prophet. I just want to say, Abdul Rahman here said, he said, to say Muhammad, peace be upon him, biography is cheap, cannot be. I don't know what you mean by that, but you said, he, peace be upon him, changed the world for the better. Abdul Rahman, please give us some ways, give us a list of ways that Muhammad changed the world for the better, because I can't think of one. But maybe you could share one, and I'll be happy to take a look at it.
How did he change the world of Bani Qurayza? How they became better? By not existing? Mm-hmm. How did he change the world of Safiya? By killing all her family? How did he change the world of Zayd when he took his wife. Do you think that's better for Zayd? How did he change the world for us today? By followers like Bin Laden and like Zawahiri and like al-Baghdadi and like all these guys? Tell me one thing that he changed the world better into. Even among his first followers, how did he change the world there when Ali is trying to fight with Aisha and Ali is trying to fight with Muawiyah, and so thousands of people got killed in their fights? How did he change the world for them? How did he change the world for Egypt when they invaded them and took their girls as slaves and took their land and took their possessions? How did he change the world for my people, the Berbers in North Africa, when he invaded them? He took 120,000. The Muslims, when they invaded North Africa, they took 120,000 of Berber girls. How did he change the world for Berber people? For the Kurds, when he invaded Syria, when he invaded what we call today Iraq, how did he change the world for those guys?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you could go down the line. I mean, all the people who've studies show, and I'll be posting some material on this in the very near future. You look at any studies of the places in the world where women have it worse, right? Where the worst places in the world, the worst places in the world to be a woman in terms of the view of women, the negative view of women, you always get 11 out of 12 of the worst countries are Muslim majority countries, or 18 out of 20, or 19 out of 20. You always get that. So this is Muhammad's impact. Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you, and don't go even far. How about people like me who left Islam? How did he change the world for them? Mm-hmm. I mean, where in the world now they kill apostates? Is it in the U.S. and the UK and Australia and Belgium and in Canada, or in Muslim countries? Mm-hmm. So look at us. We are fleeing. We are fleeing Muslim countries just because we choose another religion, and we are asking asylum here and there. And every story, I met so many former Muslims. Every story has a drama into it, a painful one. A painful story. So how did he change the world for us?
Mm-hmm. Tanvir here has a we're happy to get back to Abdul Rahman. By the way, Rachid, this is kind of funny because yesterday this kept happening. I was live with Sam Shamoun, and Muslims kept wanting, we would just bring something up, we would just mention something, and then they would challenge us on it, even though that wasn't what we were going to talk about. We would say, okay, before we get to our topic, let's go ahead and address this. So what would happen is we would just mention Aisha or something like that, and Muslims would say, well, prove this about it. And it's okay. We start pulling up the sources and stuff, and then we say something else, and they say, oh, well, try proving that. And it got to the point where after this happened over and over and over again, Sam says something about Muhammad, and I say, now, Muslims, I understand right now that you want to say he's lying. I understand that right now. Everything inside of you is saying, I never heard this from my leaders who always lie to us. Therefore, Sam must be lying. But think, that's just happened over and over and over and over and over again. You just keep thinking that we're lying, and then as soon as you say we're liars, then we pull out all your sources, and we were not going to talk about that. We weren't going to talk about Aisha being prepubescent. We weren't going to talk about that. You made us talk about that, right? Yeah. So think twice, and then all of a sudden they got quiet, and they would not challenge Sam on that issue. But I think we got a similar situation here where Abdul Rahman is going to say, "Oh, Muhammad changed the world," and he's just going to get eaten alive.
He changed the world, but to worse.
Yeah. And so, Abdul Rahman, think about what you say, because you've got Rachid right here, and he might want to point out some problems with it. Tanvir here says, here I have a question. You say that both Muhammad and Jesus have similarities in biography. If someone say that both are messengers of God, so must have some similarities, I think it goes to prove. So I think he's saying that the similarities between Jesus and Muhammad actually prove that they're both messengers, rather than proving that there was some copying going on. What are your thoughts on that? I've got some thoughts on it as well.
I mean, look at it this way. If there is a writer, he knows David,
Hmm.
and then I asked him, or like a friend of mine, he said, "Can you write us a biography of Rashid?" And he started saying, "Well, Rashid is an American, and he has this, he has white skin, and he has blue eyes, and he has this," and he started looking at everything about David and mentioning it about Rashid. We are not from the same source. It's just one guy is forging a biography of another guy and just copying from the first one. You have to prove that Muhammad really performed miracles, for example, because the Quran contradicts you. So the only explanation here is that Ibn Ishaq forged these things. Second, if we find out that Ibn Ishaq was liar, then most likely he was not telling the truth about these things. He was forging them. And third, if you have a gap of 200 years, then there is a possibility of faking things more than if it was really close to it in time. So we have several reasons. I just mentioned few to doubt the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and guys, we're going to go for a few more minutes. We're going to close out around 9:30, so we got time for a couple more questions here. But yeah, Tanvir, don't miss the point here. We know for a fact that the early Muslims were inventing stories about Muhammad to try to make him sound like he was more like one of the biblical prophets or more like Jesus. We know that is an indisputable fact. You can even see you can see where this starts in the Quran over and over and over again. The non-Muslims were challenging him. You're saying Muhammad's in the same line with these guys. Where are his miracles? Why isn't he performing miracles? And all Allah does is make excuses for why Muhammad can't perform miracles. And Allah's his ultimate point is, well, Muhammad brought the Quran. That's all he really needs. And yet we go to the later sources and they're filled with Muhammad performing all of these amazing miracles. He just lived this amazing miraculous life. Well, okay, it's clear that was such an embarrassing issue for them that they're making all this stuff up to make him sound like he's more in line with the people we read about in the Bible. What Rashid was pointing out is, once you understand that they are doing that, once you know that they're doing that, the question is just how much are they doing that? And so he points out a bunch of similarities between Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad, the earliest biography we have. We know that Ibn Ishaq is familiar with Christian sources. One, he talks about he quotes the Gospel of John trying to defend Muhammad. He also comes from a Christian family, so he knows about the Gospel. Is he actually trying deliberately to make Muhammad sound more like Jesus? We know he's doing that with the miracles. We know that. So the question is, how much is he doing that? And the problem you have is we don't know. Right?
Do you think the Quran will forget something like a star of Muhammad, and only to after 200 years to be cited by somebody who came 200 years? So God himself forgot to mention there was a star of Muhammad. But Ibn Ishaq was able to remember that. Give me a break here.
Here's another comment by Abdul Rahman. He said, so this goes back to the name issue. He said, why should we modify the parent's name? Abraham's father was an idol worshiper. Why would we need to be embarrassed? I don't think you understood anything anyone was saying.
Yeah, I have reasons to say that, because, for example, Muhammad didn't want to mention the name of his uncle, which was Abdul Uzza. He mentioned Tabbat yada Abi Lahabin wa Tab. He said Abu Lahab. He didn't say Abdul Uzza. And even for Abu Talib, they call him Abu Talib. They don't say Abdul Manaf. So they never mention his first name. They mention his like nickname. They don't, because it's very embarrassing for them. So that's why I have reasons to believe they changed the name of his dad and mom too.
Yeah. So Abdul Rahman. Yeah, we know where Abraham came from. Now imagine that we had this story about Abraham, and then supposedly Abraham came from pagans, but then it gave the name of his father, and let's suppose the name of his father was servant of Yahweh. Well, then you might start wondering if someone's messing with the names. Someone's messing with the names, right? And so when we're reading about Muhammad, and he comes from pagans, and he comes from a pagan tribe, and then his father is recorded as being the slave of Allah. Well, then you have a couple of options. Either Allah was just one God among others, and so you're the slave of Allah, you're the slave of Alusa, I'm the slave of Allah, and we have all these gods and goddesses and so on. That's certainly a possibility. But given the fact that we know your earliest historians were making things up, we just have no way of knowing, and so it's always a possibility that they're making something up for some other reason. And so so basically, here's the situation as far as I can tell, Rachid. Anytime we're reading a story in the Muslim historical works, the question should always be, is there a reason to make this up? If there is, yes. Then it's in doubt. Could have happened, but it's in doubt. You can't trust it because we know these guys would gladly make up anything if they had a reason for doing it. And so if there's a possible reason, you can't trust it. The only stuff you should be able to trust is if there's just no reason to make something up. Then you can say, okay, maybe I got something.
Yeah, and this brings the genealogy. Why the Quran never mentioned the genealogy of Muhammad, just Ibn Ishaq? Mm-hmm. And why? Because that's why I say it's an invention. Because he wanted to show him as coming from pure blood. Mm-hmm. They keep telling us he's from the best. He's from the best tribe, from the best people. That's not true. How the best tribe are pagan worshippers, mm-hmm. and how the best people are pagan worshippers. So how here we can say these people are better than the other people. So Ibn Ishaq was trying to show that Muhammad came from a pure blood, but the Gospels, that's not what they were doing. He misunderstood the Gospels. They were trying to say he's coming from David. There's a lineage here that goes to the prophecies about him coming from the line of David. It's not about being from a pure blood. So he misunderstood things, and he applied to Muhammad, and we ended up with this forged biography.
Mm-hmm. Nazareth Emmanuel said, I am Christian, but I grew up among Muslim communities reading Quran to understand its sayings and which God they were worshiping, but I have found it senseless and unattractive to read it. Yeah, this would be a good issue for you to comment on, Rachid, because Muslims tell us that the Quran is the most amazing book ever. It's the most amazing book ever. In fact, the Quran's main argument for how you can know that it's the Word of God is that no one can write something like it. It's just so wonderfully written. The Quran is the worst. I can say that, in my view, the Quran is the worst book I have ever read. And I'm not just saying that because I disagree with it, right? I read books by atheists, right? I read books by atheists. Yeah. I read the hadiths, and sometimes the hadiths are very, very interesting. They contain interesting material. The Quran is the most boring, worst book I've ever read. It's horrible. I think Rashid, there's at least one of the most famous atheist critics of Islam in the 20th century was named Antony Flew. And so, he passed away and he became some sort of theist shortly before he died. But he was asked, after he became a theist, after he started to believe in God, he was asked, do you think you'll ever actually join a specific religion like Christianity or Islam? And he said, no, I don't think I will. But he was asked, what are your thoughts on them? Because this guy spent his entire career studying religion. And he said, well, he drew three differences between Christianity and Islam. He said, one, the Apostle Paul was a brilliant scholar who spoke multiple languages and could hold his own against, the philosophers of his time. He said he had a first-rate philosophical mind. And he basically says Muhammad is the opposite, right? He's a 7th century illiterate caravan robber, apparently. He drew that comparison. Then he compared the Bible and the Quran. And he also compared Jesus and Muhammad. He said, Jesus, regardless of your view, is an incredibly charismatic figure that anyone can read about and anyone can love. He goes, Muhammad most certainly was not. But when he compared the Bible and the Quran. He said the Bible is an amazing work of literature that you can read even as an atheist, and you can appreciate its content even though you think it's false. He said to read the Quran is to do penance. You guys know what penance?
Exactly.
You know what penance is, guys. That's where you punish.
Yeah.
That's where you punish yourself for your sins. So this is Anthony Flew, who's not a Christian. He wasn't a Muslim, but he's comparing them, and he says to read the Quran is to do penance. That's what I feel like. That like I have to actually psych myself up to read it because it's so horrible. But Rashid, what the Muslims will tell me when I say something like that is it's because you're not reading it in Arabic. If you were reading it in Arabic, you would see how amazing it is and how it could only come from God. Now, Rashid, the reason I have a question here is these same Muslims who tell me, this is the evidence for Islam. They're the same people who tell me the Quran has been perfectly preserved, even though they're lying about that. They're the same people that say the Quran contains all these scientific miracles, even though the Quran's a scientific disaster. They're the same people who tell me Muhammad's the greatest man who ever lived, even though he did some of the worst things anyone could ever do. In other words, I have no trust in them because, like their early historians, they just make stuff up left and right to support their prophet. But you can read the Quran in Arabic, so tell us all. Do you agree do you agree with Muslims that it's a wonderful, amazing book, or is it as I can't believe that it's as bad as it sounds in English? So where is it? Is it somewhere in between?
I think Christopher Hitchens said if the Quran was the word of God, it was dictated in a bad day. So it's really a penance. It is really painful to read it because so much repetition, no coherence in subjects, jumps from Moses to Abraham to Jesus to Muhammad to the pagans so you see no consistency, nothing, no logic, and sometimes the logic is very, very awkward. And some arguments that are presented there, they are fallacies actually. They are not arguments. You will be like, God himself is making this mistake. And when you read it, you will be like, that's enough. I cannot. I'm a good reader. I like to read in Arabic, and I'm a writer in Arabic. And I like to read so many books in Arabic until today. But I don't enjoy at all reading the Quran. And actually the Quran itself says in chapter 4, verse 140, and he says to the early Muslim believers, he said, and it has already come down to you in the book that when you hear the verses of Allah, means the Quran, they are denied and ridiculed. So do not sit with them until they enter to another conversation. Means that the Quran itself admits it was ridiculed by the Arabs. They made fun of it. Mm-hmm. And the Quran tells the Muslims, do not sit with them until they change the topic.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. So apparently doesn't get much better. And Rashid, one time I had this long drive ahead of me and I had the Quran on CD, but it's like the professional reciters.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what? I got a couple hours to drive. Why don't I listen to this the entire time and actually see how good it is? I got this worst splitting headache of my entire life after driving for a while, listening to the Quran being recited. Anyway, interesting stuff. Johnson George here just asked, Brother David, where can I buy the history of Muhammad? You should be able to still get it on Amazon, at least in a used form. If not, it's available online. You can get it in PDF. So if you type in Ibn Ishaq, Life of Muhammad, it'll come up. You can get it in PDF form. All right, let's. I'm just going to read out the super chats real quick, and then we'll go ahead and close out. And you can give any final thoughts, final words. Sure. Apple Goo said, "Good morning, everyone." I'm guessing you are in a different part of the world. Apple Goo, Odisho, and Cheryl R in super chat and with super sticker. Philippians 2:10 said a bunch of stuff in Arabic that I can't read. George Bond said, such a long time since I've seen Brother Rachid. God bless you.
Thank you.
Paul Bishop said,
God bless you too.
Paul Bishop said, David and Brother Rachid, we pray for your ministry and keeping you well. God bless.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Lisa Look with the super sticker. Andrew Tam said, any thoughts about J. Smith's historical research that the origins of Islam and the character of Muhammad were post-7th century redactions? And so there were other people in the chat bringing up Dan Gibson's view. So what's your view, Rachid, on how much of this is?
I'm not a revisionist, so I'm not really. I have some reservations about Dan Gibson's work. Petra, that Mecca was in Petra, not there. So I will present, and actually I interviewed him, and I have something coming up that I will present. It will be in English and have subtitles in Arabic, so you will hear my whole view about it.
Yeah, and my view is I'm withholding judgment until I see some additional research, because you have the details about the mosques, and they're not pointing in the right way, and they're pointing somewhere else. And I've seen Muslim responses saying no, they're not pointing toward Petra, and it's not pointing there, and so on. And so basically, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt until I actually say, okay, here is exactly where the mosque is facing. Show me the exact direction it's facing, and then No, notice we don't just jump on whatever is critical of Islam. If I'm going to use an argument, I want to see it thoroughly defended. And finally, two more. Dion says, "May God bless you both, David and Rachid." And Eric Brown said, Here is an obituary for the Quran. Cause of death was repeated flogging to vital areas with facts and logic. Died on 4/27/2020, 9:30 p.m. So, Rachid, after your presentation, Eric Brown wrote an obituary for the Quran.
That's a good one.
All right, so Rachid, I guess we should go ahead and close out now. And any final thoughts for anyone on anything? Floor is yours.
Oh, all right. I just want to say thank you, David, for having me, and thank you for everyone who is following this chat. And I just want you to think, when I got out of trusting these sources 100%, and I got out of that, and I started comparing the gospel with the Quran, with the biography, with other books, then I started seeing the image clearer. I think for every Muslim, here's an advice: don't stay stuck within, get out of it, compare, use some logic. Get out of your emotions. Don't always just defend Islam because you are a Muslim. You need to defend the truth wherever you find it. So that's what I did, and I think you should do the same thing, because Muhammad will not save you. It's knowing the truth. The truth will set you free.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And one last comment, because it's actually relevant. iPhone 3G said, don't forget that Hafs was also considered a big liar.
That's true.
So
and Abu Huraira as well.
Yeah. So Muslims, if you don't realize how hilarious this is, basically what you have throughout your history is there are always Muslims who are calling some other Muslims liars, right? So they're all. It doesn't matter who you go to. There are other Muslims who call him liar, and so whenever we quote anything that's embarrassing. Whenever we quote something that's embarrassing, Muslims find some Muslim who called him a liar and say, you see, you have to reject everything he says, right? Well, what iPhone 3G just pointed out was Hafs was called a liar. He was treated as if he was untrustworthy. And just
right.
Rachid, why should that be a problem for Muslims?
Because Hafs is one of the guys we got the Quran through them, and we read the Quran actually today with the Riwayat Hafs, which is the transmission through Hafs. Mm-hmm. That's how we read it. So how can we trust a liar? And I heard the funniest thing I read. He's not trusted in the Hadith, and he's trusted in the Quran.
Yeah, that's what they say, right? So he's a liar. He's a liar when it comes to Hadith, but not with this transmission of the Quran.
It's like somebody you say he's not trusted with money, but he's trusted with gold.
Yeah. Funny stuff. All right, well, tons of people said thank you, and thank you, David and Rashid. Merban said, does Rashid have YouTube?
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, it's most of it in Arabic. So I'm going to start doing some stuff in English, like with David and others. So just pray for me so I can be more present in English as well.
Yeah, and actually, Rashid, as we're closing out, I'll say anytime you want to come on, especially during the coronavirus time when I'm not traveling, I'm around. So anytime you have a topic you want to cover, no problem. We'll go live.
Thank you so much for this open invitation. Thank you. God bless you.
All right, thanks, and talk to everyone, Lord willing, tomorrow. We were going to talk about some other stuff, but as usual, a Muslim in the chat brought up an issue, started challenging people, claimed that the Quran only allows defensive fighting, and so I told him, look, if you want to make that claim here in the chat, then we'll go ahead and cover that tomorrow. So Lord willing, be here tomorrow with Shameless Sam Shamoon, and we'll be showing that the Quran calls for offensive jihad, not simply defensive jihad. Catch you all then.